is talking about those arrow functions. As it says, they were introduced in ES6. When you look at them, if you look at, can you see the before and after? The before arrow function, the after. You look at it and you're like, I don't see what really buys me all that much. And it's not that it does, but it's considered a cleaner looking syntax. All right. I mean, if we ever have a test or an assignment, you do it the first way, I wouldn't take anything off. But it's just another way of doing something. Okay. In fact, when you look at the example, after it says with arrow functions, there's another one after it. And it shows if it's just one thing, one line like that, you can put it all in one line. So the idea is brevity. If you have parameters, the parameters have to come before what's called a fat arrow, the equal sign and the greater than sign. Arrow functions don't handle the word this that we talked about before. Console.log can be a good debugger. What we are going to use more than anything else for a debugger, we're going to use things like JSLint and ESLint that aren't in here. But what they're basically like pre-compilers. So what they do is they look at your code before it goes and runs it, and it comes back and returns errors that it finds for you. All right. So style and coding guidelines, this is just a review. It's all the stuff we've already talked about. Probably is nothing new in here. I don't see anything, just going through that whole thing new. Best practices, same kind of thing. Notice, avoid global variables. So this thing in here contradicts itself. You remember earlier it said, declare all your variables at the top of your program. Well, when you do that, they're global. And now it says, don't have global variables. Always declare local variables. And really, that is a better practice anyway. If you are with a declaring on top, always make sure if you declare all of them in a function, put them at the top of the function. You should initialize them, all right? And if you don't, many variables in JavaScript are automatically initialized, so what? Not all of them are. In fact, many of them are not. They'll have undefined if you try to print out their value before you give it a value. It says beware of automatic type conversion. About 2/3 of the way down, I mentioned this to you yesterday. Don't use the equal when you're comparing. Use the triple equal, which is equality and identity. Use parameter defaults when you can. You heard me give you this example last semester. If we're doing a program for Rankin, let's default the state to Missouri because 99% of the people who work at or go to school in Rankin are from Missouri. So, end your switches with defaults. Yeah, you don't have to put a default in. You always should. Finally, the last thing there, do you see where it says avoid using Eval? You can do things with the Eval function in JavaScript. Let's just put it this way. You should be allowed to do. There's a really good article if you ever want to read it, and maybe you don't, but it's called Eval is Evil, and that's what the whole thing is about. It shows you stuff that you shouldn't do that you can do with it. All right. Things mistakes often made. Again, I'm looking in here. It was like this morning when I told the gentleman when I said, yeah, you meant to say styles, and here you refer to it as just style. And he was embarrassed. I said, don't you think everybody does that? Yeah, everybody does. Professional people who are out in the field. I mean, when I say professional, I don't mean a person like me who teaches it. I mean like people who program it, that's all they do all day long, make those mistakes. Performance, they've got some clues in there, things you might want to use. Okay. And that's actually a really good, do you see the bad and the better code under the performance examples? Imagine that you had a million things that you were checking in there, so that the array length was 1,000,000. In the first case, it's going to make that check 1,000,000 times. In that second case, it's going to make the check once, because it knows what the actual value is. Working with a DOM can really slow down a program. Sometimes you have to. Reserved words we already looked at. The last couple things that are in here talk about the what's new in version ES5. That was that, as it says, that was 2009. The next thing is what's new in ES6. That was 2015. It says, what is Ecma script 6? Did I ever tell you what Ecma stands for or not? It's the European Computer Manufacturing Association, believe it or not. It's basically, it's the equivalent of the W3C, but for JavaScript. Last thing that's in this section is Json, so let's take a look at that. You've heard the word before. You've seen a little bit of it, but we're going to start, like I said, in 2 weeks. It's going to be a lot of Json. It's a format for storing and transporting data. All right, it's often used when data is sent from a server to a web page. That's how we're going to use it. It's JavaScript object notation. Notice it may not seem like a big thing, but it says it's lightweight, which just means it's less memory intensive. All right. In fact, what is it? AJAX, and you probably have heard me say this before, is an acronym that stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. But the funny thing is, today most people don't say that. They say AJAX just stands for AJAX. And the reason is you hardly ever use XML anymore. You use JSON because it's faster. And it looks a lot like JavaScript objects, which is another good reason for using it. All right, so you can see the JSON example there. We're going to do something really similar to that. This is one of the first things we're going to create is going to be similar to that. We're going to make employees. All right, and we'll just put in 3 employees just to keep it simple. And you'll see how you can get all your employees, how you can change an employee's information, how you can add a new employee, and how you can delete employees. Again, those are the major CRUD operations that you're going to do with any API. All right. It's all done with name-value pairs, and they show you that in there. JSON objects are in curly braces. You're going to see, like I said, you're going to see all of this stuff. If you want to convert JSON text to a JavaScript object, you use parse. When you go the other way, you use stringify. All right, let's see, what else do we have here? There'll be a big section on JSON too later. So, all right, the next thing then is JS forms. Again, form validation. Why do you do it? Because it's much better to put this code on the client side than it is to send it out to a server. All right. They've got their guessing game right there. I guess I never even saw this one. It's funny because that was one of the things you had on a test. All right, I guess you could have probably went there and found it rather. But let's face it, you can go almost anywhere if you look hard enough on the internet and find stuff out. So, Forms API, JavaScript validation API. All right, constraint validation DOM methods. Well, this is one way that you can check for things. Check validity and set custom validity. All right. We're not going to be hitting on on really most of that stuff. Let's look at the objects next. We'll do the objects and the functions. Let me see what time it is. 8, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We'll see. All right, so let's go and do the object stuff. Object definitions are shown first. Again, some of this is repetitious. In other words, we've already talked about it. All right. in JavaScript, almost everything is an object. So even if you say var age equal 21, technically it's an object. You don't want to treat it like one, but technically everything in JavaScript, all right, says all values except primitives are objects. But really, in kind of like under the hood, everything is an object. You know what the primitives are. We've talked about these before, so there's nothing new there. All right. Let's see. Most people, when they talk about an object, if you look down, they've got this, again, you saw this before, where it says var person. When you think of an object, it's got a lot of different components to it. All right. Normally that's, it's a collection of named values, and they mention that there. Says here about 2/3 of the way down, JavaScript objects are mutable. It says they are addressed by reference, not value. What that means is, once you declare a value, if you do change the values that are in it, it's going to be in a different place in memory. Does that make sense? Properties, again, we want some of this, gets more, so where it's very, very repetitious. Object name dot property, or object name, and then in brackets, double quote, property, double quote. You've already seen this. Notice right underneath that, they've got the for in loop. As it says, that's a quicker way. It's a little less code than writing a regular for loop, but it actually, internally, it runs faster, okay, than using a regular for loop. Now it says they're adding new properties. It says you can add new properties to an object basically by just including them. You can. That's the more old-fangled way of doing things. That's using the prototype type of method, but you can do it that way. Methods we talked about, they've got the this keyword, etc. This is all, there's a lot of repetition in here, as you can see. Typically, when you display them, you put them into a loop. Again, nothing new there. Accessors. It's funny because some books will say accessors are getters, and some books, like this one, will say accessors are getters and setters. All right. This is the way that they're showing it right here with this JavaScript getter, for example, and the JavaScript setter. Not exactly the same, but it's more along the lines of what we're going to do next semester in the Java and Android class. All right. A constructor, if you create a constructor, it's whenever you create an instance of an object, the constructor is automatically called. If you don't make a constructor, an empty one gets called. So you can see this thing that says function person here under JavaScript object constructors. That expects that every time you create a new person, you will give that person a first name, a last name, an age, and an eye color. Okay. Objects basically are instances of a class, and classes are like blueprints. All right. They tell you what the object will look like. Again, they show you how you can add properties and add methods. As I said, that's more or less the more old school style way of doing it, but there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. Speaking of which, that's the prototypes, which is next. All right. It says in the previous chapter, we learned how to create an object constructor. When you go and add things to it, all right, so if you take something that didn't exist and you add something to it, you're prototyping it. All right, and that's what they show. If you go down about halfway on this object prototypes, it says all JavaScript objects inherit properties and methods from a prototype. Okay. And they show you how you can use it. So look at the example. Do you see where it says using the prototype property? All right, what that's saying is each person has a first name, a last name, an age, and an eye color. But if you decide later, you could just say person.prototype dot and give it a brand new, you can give it a brand new attribute. All right. You can do that with methods too. What's you might say, well, big deal, should I care? One thing that's cool about it, you can take existing JavaScript like string methods and stuff, you can add your own methods onto those. See what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So with Ecma or ES5, now you can do it more or less. You can do a lot of things, like I said, the way you do them in JavaScript. I'm sorry, in Java. That's the last one that's in here, the thing on classes. This is not not identical. This is similar though to the way that we'll do things in Java next semester. Let's at least go through the next section, which is on functions. Then we got what? DOM, browser DOM, Ajax, Json. I mean, there's still quite a bit left, but that's okay because we've already gone through the thing on the tutorial there. That's pretty big. We went through all that, and a lot of this is repeated. So let's just look at the function stuff. That'll get us till about 2 o'clock, little around there. And then we'll just call it a period, and you'll be able to spend the rest of the period looking at or continuing on in the assignment that I gave you, okay? All right. So function definitions. This is all taken from what we saw before. Remember, again, you go down a little further, function expressions. A Java function can be defined using an expression. When you do that, you store the result of the function in a variable. All right. So X basically is going to hold, in that case, the value that's returned from that function. That function does not have a name, meaning it's an anonymous function. So if you call that function, you pass in 3 and 2, it's going to return 3 times 2, which is 6, and it'll put the result in X. Make sense? Okay. JavaScript functions under this function constructor are defined with a function keyword. You can also use a function constructor. Guess what? I don't know about you. I have never done that. Until I looked at this a little earlier, I had no idea that you could even do anything like this. Is there anything wrong with it? No. Would you ever want to do it? I'm tired of telling people, oh, you'll never do this, you'll never do that. Who knows? But I have never used it, and I don't know, I've written a lot of JavaScript over the years, but I didn't even know it existed. Hoisting we already talked about. Self-invoking functions about halfway down on this function definition page. A self-invoking function is invoked or started automatically without being called. All right. Putting those parentheses afterwards, do you see that in the example? The parentheses don't, that's what calls it. Okay. And if that function required parameters, you'd have to put parameters in those parentheses. All right. So without the parentheses, it's just a function declaration. I think this is an iffy right here. I could be wrong, but I think it is. That's immediately. I can't remember what iffy stands for. Let's see once. Immediately invoked function expression. That is what these are. Okay. Functions can be used as values. Look, you see that example where it's got var x equal my function? Do you see that? All right. Notice there's not even a return there. Why? Because it's going to call my function. That's got a return. Okay, so again, 4 and 3, that'll set x equal to 12. That should hopefully just make sense. Functions are objects, so functions can have properties, functions can have methods. Arrow functions down near the bottom, you've already talked about it, all right? And again, my hope is going through this stuff, you know, first of all, you know, you're a very, very intelligent guy. That said, you're not going to remember everything. Hell, I don't. But it's much easier to relearn something that you've at least seen than it is, gee, we never went through that before. We never went through that before. I don't want to do that. Parameters and arguments, you know what parameters are. As it says, JavaScript function definitions do not specify data types. They don't do type checking. So in other words, if you're expecting age and you put in there hello, it's going to set age equal to hello. All right, you can have default parameters. They show an example on, it's not a good one, about a third of the way down. I don't know if you see it. It says Ecma 2015 allows default parameter values in the function declaration. You see that example? Mm-hmm. Yes or no? Yeah. Okay. Remember, if you've got more than one parameter and you only want one of them to be defaulted, it has to be last. That's the key takeaway. You've got to remember that, otherwise you get errors. The arguments object in here, as it says, JavaScript functions have a built-in object called the arguments object. All right. So notice right here where it says x equal find max. So the length of arguments in there would be 6 because there's 6 values in there. All right. Where it's got arguments.length. Okay. So each of those. So the 1 is argument 0. 123 is argument 1. 500 is argument 2. 115 is argument 3. 44 is argument 4. And 88 is argument 5. All right. The parameters in a function call are known as arguments. That's a big thing. You can even read stuff on that. Some people say, you know, what's the difference between an argument and a parameter? Some people use them interchangeably. All right, it's not really that big a thing one way or the other. Objects are passed by reference, where primitives are passed by value. What that means is arguments you pass if you pass an object into a function, you pass the address of where the object lives. So any change you make is a permanent change. Primitives, when you pass in, it's a copy. So if you make changes, you're changing the copy. Oops, try that again. Function invocation, we talked about that before. When you call a function, you're invoking it. All right, and there's more again on this keyword. Some of the stuff you've already seen in here. Like I said, a lot of the stuff at the top, the reason I went through it is it's just repeating it as we're going down here. With the call method, you can write a method that can be used on different objects, so there actually is a call statement. I've never used that. Function apply. Notice it says method reuse. With the apply method, you can write a method that can be used on different objects. All right. It's similar to call. Okay, and there's an example. I've never used either one of those, and I don't think that we'll have to either. The last thing that's in here, so it's the last one I'll touch on right now. Please read this yourself, even if nothing else. Closures are an important topic. They're used a lot. There is a very decent chance that if you go in for an interview, for example, let's say that you want to become a web developer and you take a JavaScript test, they're going to ask you about closures. So let's go through this and then we'll be done for the day. As it says, JavaScript variables can belong to the local scope, meaning they're only known within a function they're declared, or global scope rather when they're known everywhere. Global variables can be made local variables by using closures. All right. Global variables, again, when you do it on top, as it says right there, a function can access all variables defined inside of a function like this. But a function can also access variables outside of a function. You probably already know that. All right. So notice we didn't have to pass a in that second example. Do you see where it says var a equal 4? All right. It says in the last example, a is a global variable. In a web page, global variables, belong to the window object. It can be used and changed by all scripts on a page. Okay, variables created without var letter const are always global. Okay, I already mentioned that to you. You should never do that. We already talked about that. We talked about the variable lifetime, which is the next thing. Global variables live until the page is out of memory. You go to another page, you close the window or whatever. Local variables only live while the routine is going. So it says here a counter dilemma. Suppose you want a variable for counting something and you want this counter to be available to all functions. You could use a global variable and a function to increase the counter. So they're showing what you could use. Notice that since they say var counter equals 0 at the top, it's global. All right, and we are adding to it. It says the counter should now be 3. So let's try it. All right. And again, it looks like it is. Fine. It says there's a problem with the solution above. Any code on the page can change the counter without calling add. Since it's a global variable, it can have what's referred to as a side effect, meaning sometimes the side effect is intended. If I call a function called add2 and I pass in a and b, and a's got 12 and b has got 10, it's going to return 22, right? 12 plus 10. That's a wanted side effect. An unwanted side effect is when a routine that shouldn't be able to do something is able to do something. And it can do that in this case because it's a global variable. All right. So it says the counter should be local to the add function to prevent other routines from changing it. Okay. Now, you see that example right there? It says the counter should be 3, but it's 0. All right. The big thing about this, and the reason that is important, is every time the function is called, it's recreating the value. It's going through the line that says var counter equals 0. So even though it's adding 1 to it every time, it's throwing that away and it's starting back at 0. That's why it's 0. And that's what they say, and that's why it didn't work. It says we can remove the global counter and access the local counter by letting the function return it. All right. So what do we have now? Well, we've got this counter var equals 0, counter plus equal 1, return counter. But again, notice the value. It's 1. That's not right. All right. It says it did not work because we reset the counter every time we call the function. Now, the way to get around that, you may or may not remember this. When we were in C#, we would sometimes declare variables. We'd say static. All right. That's pretty much what we're talking about here. When you declare something as static, you initialize it once, and it keeps that value. That's what we're basically looking for here. So, all functions have access to the global scope. In fact, in JavaScript, all functions have access to the scope, what's called above them. JavaScript supports nested functions. They have access to the global scope. In this example, the inner function plus has access to the counter of the parent. All right, so the key thing is, if you look at this, we've got a function in a function. Can you see that? All right. It says this could have solved the counter dilemma if we could reach the plus function from the outside. So we need a way to execute counter equals 0 only once. So, and finally there near the bottom, we need a closure. It says, remember self-invoking functions. It says, what does this function do? All right, look at the difference. By putting in those parens at the end and calling it like that, it is smart enough to retain its value. Does that make sense? Because that's the key. And they explain it afterwards. It says, add is assigned the return value of a self-invoking function. So that self-invoking part of it, the part that says var counter equals 0, only runs once. That's what we want. As it says here, this is called a JavaScript closure. It makes it possible for a function to have private variables. All right. The counter is protected by the scope of the anonymous function and can only be changed using the add function. All right. That's it. That should be good for today. So we'll pick it up tomorrow at JS, HTML DOM, we'll do the browser DOM, we'll do Ajax and JSON. If we get even that far, that'll be good. Because then what we'll have left are APIs, JS versus jQuery, some examples and some references. All right? So like I said, we'll pick it up there tomorrow at the talking about the DOM. You get a chance to look at it before then, great. If you don't, it's also going to be fine. Okay? All right. So, you just continue working on your assignment, okay?